Hello. So this week we're going to look at ethical research. So thinking about the IRB and human subjects and how to handle research with human beings in such a way that we can protect our participants. Some of this you may have heard before, but since this is a graduate course, I'm trying to spin this on a little bit more of a way that highlights the gray area because there are rules and there are things you can do and things you cannot do, but it's much more interesting to get into how we came to those rules and how they fit and how they apply. So that's what we're going to talk a little bit more about this week. I wanted to start us off with a great Calvin and Hobbes strip that I love. Um, uh, you can take a second to read this as I talk. Essentially, Calvin is saying, um, I have one set of rules for myself and one set of rules for everyone else. So often the case, whether we are able to acknowledge it and reflect on it as Calvin does here or not. Hopefully we'll be more consistent in our research about the rules that we have for protecting ourselves and the rules we have for protecting others. One of the main studies in classical conditioning, looking at the response of a dog, Pavlov's dog, to the sound of a bell, pairing unconditioned stimulus with a conditioned stimulus. This is a classic psychology experiment. On the other hand, this challenges some aspects of ethics, in particular because we have historically done research like this with humans. In particular, one of Pavlov's students did some research like this with orphan children. Problem there being they're minors, so they don't have parental support. If you adopt them in order to get parental support, which would mean, or parental permission, which would be your permission if you were the adopter, there's also some issues there. Other people looking at this issue had argued these kids are better off because they're in the care of Pavlov's student than they might be were they not being attended to by Pavlov, because they were adopted and fed regularly, and et cetera, et cetera. So one of the ways that we figure out in general whether something is going to be ethical or whether we're going to call something ethical is whether the behaviors or experiences likely to occur to the participants are outside of their normal experience. What is their normal daily experience? Is this common for them or not? Some of the first kind of rationale that we have along what things to do and what things not to do comes actually out of World War II. In following some of the horrendous experiments that were done without permission on prisoners of war, on Jews and others who were placed in concentration camps during World War II, we came up with the Nuremberg Code. This was part of the War Crimes Tribunal following World War II, trying to assure that none of these atrocities would happen ever again, and how to put rules and laws in place so that this would be the case, so that things would not happen again. One of the things that we observe is that anybody who is involved in research must give voluntary consent. You have to have voluntary consent. We'll talk a little bit more late in a second video about what consent should look like, how to assert that that is voluntary. The research must be the benefit of society in general. If it's anything that has any potential implications for the well-being of the participant, you must have tried this out on animals first. You must avoid physical and mental suffering when at all possible. You need to show that you have prevented injury or don't expect injury from the research that you're doing. People that are conducting research must be qualified professionals, and the participant can end the experiment whenever they wish. They've got to be able to stop what's going on whenever they'd like to. One example that gets us into some of these issues and has been argued quite a bit in terms of ethics and what we know about ethics, what we believe about ethics, is the Tuskegee experiment. So the Public Health Service used to run the Tuskegee Institute, which is what the Tuskegee experiment was named after and where it came from. This was a study that was initially started by the Public Health Service, started by a governmental organization. Later, after many, many reviews that it passed, was terminated. But the idea in this study, there was no, at the time when the study began, there was no cure for syphilis. So the goal for this study was to figure out what the history of syphilis is. We got to understand how it works on the body, how it affects people. Um, and So they found a community that was mostly poor sharecropper Black men, not a whole lot of education, as was common for the time because of um, segregation and unequal opportunities. Um, they found 600 Black men, half of whom had syphilis, a little more than half had syphilis. The researchers spoke to these men about their condition and told them that this is why they wanted them to be in the study. They did not give the participants full understanding of what was going on in the study because they considered the more medical explanation of syphilis to be beyond what these guys could understand. And so they used the local term bad blood that the guys had, and told them that's what they had. In exchange for participating in this experiment, the men were given free medical exams, free meals when they came to have the medical exams, and burial insurance. So medical exams, if you know you're sick, is a pretty persuasive uh, benefit for participating. The other thing here is burial insurance for people who were really poor. The promise of not leaving your family a debt to pay when you pass away was huge. So even more so than free meals or free medical exams, the burial insurance was a big deal. And by several accounts, this burial insurance was not actually given to the men when they died. Okay. So the question here, the one that we continue to consider is, was this participation overly induced, right? What we're talking about there is it's okay to pay a nominal amount for people to participate in research, but when it's not okay is when that amount is so much that there's no way I could possibly say no. So if I pay you uh, $10 to be in a research study for an hour and a half, that's pretty reasonable. On the other hand, if I was going to give you $100 for taking a survey for 30 minutes, that's probably unreasonable compensation. $100 for taking a survey, not nearly as risky as what we're talking about with Tuskegee, but this is where some of those kinds of concepts got called into question. How much is too much to offer somebody? Um, Another thing with Tuskegee is they weren't very good at ensuring confidentiality. There was some stigma in the community about bad blood, so these guys would have been outed by their participation to others in the community. One of the ways that we currently work on ensuring confidentiality is to not link names to the data whenever possible. We can use ID numbers, so have a consent with that is with an ID number, put the consent away in a locked place or secure place, and then only use the consent or the ID numbers from there on. And we also can report only summary data. So looking only at aggregate or using archival data is even less worrisome, because then the names or identifying information is not traceable to the actual answers or data from that person. Okay, getting back to the Tuskegee experiment, when proper treatment for syphilis became available, participants were not given this treatment because of the desire of the researchers to continue with the experiment. Um, when patients who were involved in the Tuskegee experiment were seen by other doctors, these other doctors were, the Tuskegee doctors spoke to other doctors and said, don't tell um, the patients about this. Indeed, other doctors were counseled to not interfere or provide treatment for Tuskegee participants. Um, Again, the study lasted for over 40 years. In 1970, the media broke the news, and this led to congressional hearings. In 1972, the study was ended by the Department of Health. In 1997, the government made a formal apology and is now paying restitution to Tuskegee families. So it took us a long time to decide that this is not the right thing to do in the case of Tuskegee. Okay, so we're going to stop there and leave the rest for a second video that will be mostly on informed consent.